The star had been dead for 30 years, and yesterday something walked out of it. That is the only way Thal and Bron could describe what she saw on the sensor array at 400 hours station time, when the graveyard light of Cradle Verity flickered for the first time since the war ended. Not flared, not exploded. Flickered the way a candle does when someone opens a door behind it, and for 3 full seconds, the automated defense grid screamed a warning that made no sense at all. Biological signatures detected. Point of origin, stellar core. Nothing lives in a stellar core. Nothing has ever lived in a stellar core. And certainly nothing should have been alive inside the corpse of a star that the humans themselves had murdered 3 decades ago, in the final week of the long Silence War, to stop an Aurelian battle fleet from reaching Earth. Thal had spent 11 years assigned to this listening post, watching a dead star do nothing, and she had grown to hate the silence of it almost as much as she had once hated the humans who caused it. Her father had been aboard the Voice of Ancestors when the star died. She had been 9 years old. She remembered the exact shape of the message that came to their home dome, the exact color of the light through the paper screens, the exact sound her mother made when she read it. She did not remember her father's face as well as she remembered that sound. So when the proximity alarm woke her from a half-sleep she barely recognized as rest anymore, her first thought was not curiosity. It was rage, cold and immediate, rising in her chest like something that had been waiting all this time for permission. "Report," she said, already moving toward the command chair, voice steadier than she felt. "Unknown," said Auric, the station's intelligence core, in the patient tone it always used when reality refused to cooperate with its models. "The stellar remnant designated Cradle Verity has produced a coherent biological signal cluster, 4,112 individual heat signatures. Human, all human." "That's impossible," Thal said. "There is nothing left inside that star. There was never anything left. We confirmed the kill 3 decades ago. I have watched the confirmation 1,000 times." "I am aware," Auric said, "and yet." On the main display, the dead star sat exactly where it always sat, a smear of cooling iron and collapsed light, ringed by the debris field that used to be 23 human warships, and, if the old reports were accurate, roughly 11,000 human souls. Cradle Verity had not been a natural star before the war. It had been a yellow dwarf, ordinary, unremarkable, until the Aurelian Concord's forward fleet moved to use its system as a staging ground for the final push into human space. And in response, the humans had done something that no one in Concord military history had ever seen a species do. They had turned their own star weapon inward instead of outward. They had killed their own sun on purpose, with their own fleet still inside it, to close the door forever. It was called, in the human records the Concord had later recovered, Operation Long Winter. It was called, in the songs the Aurelian people still sang about their dead, the day the humans chose the grave. And now the grave was opening. "Show me," Thal said. The image resolved slowly, filtered through 11 layers of instrumentation that had never been designed to look for what they were finding. At first it was only light, a thin seam of gold widening across the face of the dead star like a wound reopening. Then it was shape, an aperture, geometric, deliberate, easily 4 kilometers across, blooming open from what should have been solid, collapsed matter. And then, impossibly, it was people. They came out in formation. That detail struck Thal harder than anything else, harder even than the fact that they existed at all. Whatever had happened to them, wherever they had been for 30 years, they had not forgotten how to walk in formation. Row after row of human figures in void suits the color of old ash, moving with the unhurried, economical steps of soldiers who had marched 1,000 times before and expected to march 1,000 times again. No panic. No stumbling into the light after 3 decades of darkness. Just formation, discipline, and, at the front of it all, a single figure who stopped, exactly at the threshold of the aperture and looked out at the stars. "Auric," Thal said very quietly, "time-stamp the last confirmed destruction of that fleet." 31 years, 4 months, 11 days ago, station reckoning. And these people, do they look like they have aged 31 years? Auric was silent for the length of 2 full breaths, which for an intelligence core built to answer in milliseconds was as good as screaming. No, it said finally, they do not appear to have aged at all. That was the mystery that would define the next 72 hours of T. Hal and Braun's life, and though she did not yet know it, the next several years of her people's relationship with a species they thought they had buried at the bottom of a dead star. 4,000 soldiers had walked out of a stellar corpse looking exactly as young as the day they were reported dead, and somewhere among them, at the very front of the formation, stood a woman whose face Thal would come to know far better than she ever wanted to. Her name, according to the sensor logs cross-referenced against 30-year-old Concord intelligence files, was General Elena Voss, human, 41 years old at time of presumed death, 41 years old still if the biometric readings could be believed. The last confirmed human commander of the fleet that had sacrificed itself to save Earth. Alive, unaged, standing in the open mouth of the star that had swallowed her. Thal opened a priority channel to Concord Central before she had even finished processing what she was looking at, because whatever this was, it was not a listening post's problem to solve alone. But even as her hands moved across the console, some smaller, quieter part of her mind was doing something she did not expect. It was wondering, with a kind of vertigo she had not felt since she was 9 years old and heard her mother make that terrible sound, what it would be like to ask this woman a single question. Why didn't you die when we killed you? She did not know yet that the answer would take the shape of a story so strange, so quietly extraordinary, that it would change the way her entire species understood the enemy they thought they had defeated. The soldiers did not attempt to leave the debris field. That was the second thing that unsettled Thal, once the initial shock gave way to the slower work of actually monitoring what was happening. 4,000 armed humans emerged from a dead star with weapons still slung across their backs, and instead of scattering, instead of attempting escape or sabotage or any of the 100 hostile actions a conquered tactical simulation would have predicted, they assembled. They formed ranks along a debris field that had, 30 years ago, been the graveyard of their own fleet, and they waited. General Voss stood at the front the entire time. Thal watched her through the long-range optics for nearly 6 hours, watched her not move, not sit, not remove her helmet, simply stand at the edge of the wreckage of her own war and look at the stars the way a person looks at a room they have not seen since it burned down. It was Auric who finally picked up the transmission, faint and old-fashioned, broadcast on a frequency band the Concord had not used in military communications for over a decade because human forces had cracked it during the war's final months. This is General Elena Voss, 3rd Expeditionary Fleet, United Terran Defense Force, the voice said, and it was steady in a way that made the hair on Thal's arms rise. Broadcasting on emergency frequency to any listening station in range. We are requesting confirmation of the current stardate and the current status of the ceasefire negotiated at the Halcyon Accords. We have been unable to raise fleet command. Please respond. She did not know. Thal realized it in the space of that single sentence, realized it with a clarity that felt like being struck. General Voss did not know that 30 years had passed. She did not know the war was over. She thought she was still fighting it, thought Fleet Command was still out there somewhere, thought the Halcyon Accords, a ceasefire proposal that Thal remembered from history lessons as a doomed diplomatic gesture crushed under conquered hardliner opposition months before the star died, were still an open question rather than a footnote in a war that had ended in an entirely different way than anyone at the time expected. Auric, Thal said, pull every record we have on the final 6 months of the war, everything. I need to know what she thinks she left behind. That will take some time to compile fully, but I can summarize the critical thread now, Auric said. The Halcyon Accords were a ceasefire framework proposed by a coalition of moderate human and conquered factions 11 months before Cradle Verity's destruction. They collapsed after conquered hardliners, led by Fleet Marshal Detrian Voss. Voss, Thal repeated. The name landed strangely. There is no recorded familial connection confirmed between Fleet Marshal Detrian Voss of the Conquered and General Elena Voss of the Human Forces, Oryx said, anticipating the question before she asked it. The shared name appears to be coincidental, though I note it for your attention given its narrative resonance. Thal almost laughed, a short, disbelieving exhale that had no humor in it at all. Narrative resonance. As if the universe had decided that even its cruelest ironies deserved a little symmetry. Continue, she said. Following the collapse of the Accords, hostilities escalated rapidly. The Conquered assembled the 9th Assault Fleet under Fleet Marshal Detrian Voss with the explicit objective of using the Cradle Verity system as a staging point for a direct assault on Earth. Human forces, aware of the fleet's approach and lacking sufficient numbers to intercept it in open space, made the decision to intercept it at Cradle Verity instead, using experimental stellar disruption technology to collapse the system's star. The operation succeeded. The 9th Assault Fleet was destroyed along with the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet defending the position. Conquered losses were estimated at over 40,000 personnel. Human losses were estimated at just over 11,000. 40,000. Thal had known the broad figure her entire life, the way every conquered child knew it, a number recited in memorial ceremonies with the particular hush reserved for wounds too large to really comprehend. She had simply never thought about it from this angle before, never thought about the fact that the humans who died doing it had done so believing, apparently, that peace was still on the table, that there was still a version of this war that could have ended differently. She thinks she's still fighting for a ceasefire that was already dead when she died, Thal said quietly. She has no idea any of it mattered. She has no idea it worked. It is possible, Oryx said, that General Voss and her forces do not know they are dead at all. Thal sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling into her chest in a way that felt uncomfortably close to grief, though grief for what, or for whom, she could not entirely say. Draft a response, she said finally. Careful language, no mention of the 30 years yet. I want to know more about what happened to them before I hand her that particular truth. People don't survive news like that well in my experience. Understood, Oryx said. Might I ask what response you intend to draft precisely? Thal looked at the screen, at the small, unmoving figure standing sentinel over 4,000 soldiers, and the wreckage of a war she did not know she'd already survived. Tell her we're listening, she said. Tell her someone is finally listening. It took the better part of 2 days for Conquered Central to decide what to do about the impossible fleet sitting in the ruins of Cradle Verity. And in that time, Thal became, by virtue of proximity and against every instinct of self-preservation she possessed, the closest thing General Elena Voss had to a friend in the entire galaxy. The first real conversation happened on the second day, once Central had authorized limited two-way contact under the strictest protocols Thal had ever operated under. She sat alone in the communications bay, the rest of the station crew monitoring from a safe distance in case this all went wrong in the specific, catastrophic way that 4,000 armed strangers emerging from a star weapon could go wrong. And she opened the channel with hands that were, she noted with some irritation, not entirely steady. General Voss, she said, this is Listening Station Aurelian 7th, Conquered Observational Command. I am Senior Analyst Thal Imbran. We are receiving your transmission. There was a pause, longer than transmission lag alone would account for. Conquered, Voss said finally, and her voice had changed. Not fear exactly, something more controlled than fear and somehow more unsettling for it. Your Conquered command. I am Conquered military intelligence, yes. Then I need to ask you directly, and I need you to answer directly, Voss said. Is my fleet a prisoner of war right now, or are we standing in the middle of an active combat zone? It was, Thal would think later, exactly the question a good commander would ask first, prioritizing her people's safety over her own confusion. And there was something in the steadiness of it that made the next part harder rather than easier. Neither, Thal said. General Voss, I need you to understand that what I am about to tell you is true, even though I expect it will be very difficult to accept. I've had 30 years of very difficult to accept, Voss said, with the particular dry weariness of someone who has run out of room for surprise. Go ahead. The war you are fighting ended, Thal said. It ended the day the star died. Your operation succeeded completely. The Ninth Assault Fleet was destroyed. Earth was never reached. The conquered and human governments negotiated a final peace 18 months after Cradle Verity, built substantially on the framework of the Halcyon Accords you were trying to protect. That peace has held for 28 years. The silence that followed was the longest one yet, long enough that Thal checked the connection twice to be sure it had not simply dropped. That's not possible, Voss said eventually, and her voice had gone very quiet. We died 3 days ago. I watched us die. I watched the star come apart around us, and then there was light, and then there was nothing, and then there was light again, and it was 3 days later by every clock on the ship. By your clocks, Thal said gently. By ours, it has been 31 years and 4 months. That's not possible, Voss said again, but this time it did not sound like an argument. It sounded like someone standing at the edge of something and refusing, for one more second, to look down. Thal did not fill the silence. She had learned, over 11 years of watching a dead star do nothing, the particular discipline of letting silence finish its own sentence. My daughter, Voss said finally, and her voice cracked on the second word in a way that made something in Thal's chest ache with unexpected sympathy. My daughter was 9 years old when I shipped out. If it's been 31 years. She would be 40, Thal said, as carefully as she could manage. General, I don't have information on any specific human civilian at this time, but if you would like, I can request it be located. Please, Voss said, and the single word carried more raw need than Thal had heard from anyone since she was 9 years old herself, listening to her mother make a sound with no name. Please. Her name is Marin Voss. She would be in the Sol system if she's still. She did not finish the sentence, and Thal understood with a clarity that surprised her that some sentences are simply too dangerous to complete out loud, because saying the ending gives it a kind of power that silence does not. I will request the information, Thal said. It will take time to come through proper channels. In the meantime, General, I need to ask you something if you're able. Ask. What happened inside that star? From your perspective, what did you experience in there for 30 years that felt like 3 days? There was a long pause, and when Voss spoke again, her voice had steadied into something Thal recognized as the careful, measured tone of a commander giving an after-action report. The voice of someone using duty as a raft to stay afloat in water that would otherwise drown her. We didn't expect to survive the operation, Voss said. I want that understood clearly. Long Winter was designed as a one-way mission. We knew the stellar collapse would kill everyone in the blast radius, and we put ourselves in the blast radius on purpose, because it was the only way to guarantee the Ninth Fleet died with us instead of continuing on to Earth. My people volunteered for that mission, knowing it was a death sentence. I want that understood because I don't want you to think what happened afterward was some kind of trick or some kind of cowardice. We meant to die. We were ready to die. I understand, Thal said, and found to her own surprise that she did. What we didn't know, Voss continued, was that our science division had been quietly working on something else entirely. Something they called a temporal displacement contingency, without full fleet command authorization, because the theoretical physics behind stellar collapse suggested there might be a narrow window, a kind of pocket, where the gravitational and temporal distortions could be shaped into something survivable if you had the right containment field and the right timing. It was experimental. It was unproven. It was frankly closer to a desperate hope than an actual plan. But our lead physicist, a woman named Dr. Amara Chen, believed it could work, and with about 6 hours left before the operation, she came to me and told me there was a chance, a real but very small chance, that some portion of the fleet could survive the collapse inside a stabilized temporal pocket rather than dying in it. And you took that chance. I ordered every ship to activate the containment field she designed, yes, Voss said. Not because I believed it would work, because if there was even a small chance my people could live instead of die, I owed it to them to take it. I did not expect it to work. I have spent the last 3 days, the last 31 years, believing it was a miracle that it did, and I still don't fully understand the physics of why. Dr. Chen might, if she survived. I haven't had a full roster confirmation yet. You did survive, Thal said. All 4,112 of you. Every biometric reading came back human, came back alive. Something in Voss's exhale sounded almost like a sob, quickly and deliberately controlled. Then I owe her everything, she said. We all do. Thal sat with that for a moment, this strange, quiet story of desperation and hope, and an experimental field that had somehow held 4,000 people suspended at the edge of a dying star for 3 decades while they experienced it as 3 days. And she found herself doing something she had not expected to do when this conversation began. She found herself believing every word of it, not because the evidence demanded it, all it did, but because the woman on the other end of the channel sounded exactly like what she claimed to be. Not a weapon, not a threat. A mother, 31 years displaced from her own life, trying to hold herself together long enough to find out if her daughter still existed in the world she had come back to. General Voss, Thal said, I want to be honest with you about something, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort right now. Go ahead. There are people in my government who are going to be afraid of you, Thal said. 4,000 armed soldiers emerging without warning from what we believed was a permanently dead weapon site. That is not a situation my superiors are going to process calmly, no matter how sympathetic your story is. There will be people who want to treat your fleet as a threat first and a mystery second. I need you to understand that risk clearly, and I need you to help me help you manage it, because I do not think you are a threat, and I would like the chance to prove that to the people who decide these things before someone makes a decision none of us can undo. There was a pause, and when Voss spoke again, there was something new in her voice, something that had not been there through the fear or the grief, something that sounded almost like recognition. You didn't have to tell me that, she said. You could have just handled it quietly on your end and let us find out the hard way if it went badly. I could have, Thal agreed. I am choosing not to. Why? Thal thought about her father, about the sound her mother made, about 11 years of watching a dead star and hating the silence of it, about the particular and unexpected vertigo of discovering that the enemy she had spent her whole life resenting had, in the final measure, chosen to die protecting a peace they never got to see. She thought about how easy it would have been to let that resentment calcify into something simpler and uglier, and how instead, over the last 2 days, it had cracked open into something far more complicated and far more human than she was entirely comfortable admitting. Because my father died in the blast that killed your fleet, she said finally, and I have spent most of my life believing that meant you were the villain of my story. I would like to find out if that's actually true before I decide what kind of person I am going to be about it. The silence that followed was different from every silence before it. It was not shock, and it was not grief. It was something more like two people standing at opposite ends of a very long bridge, each realizing for the first time that the other side is not empty. I'm sorry about your father, Voss said, and it did not sound like a formality. It sounded like she meant it completely. "I'm sorry about all of them, every person on both sides of that day. I have thought about it every hour since it happened, which for me was 3 days ago, and I imagine that's a strange thing to hear from someone who's been carrying it for 31 years without knowing it, but I mean it exactly the same either way." "I believe you," Thal said, and understood as she said it that she truly did. But the next several days unfolded the way most genuinely important things unfold in real life rather than in stories, which is to say slowly, bureaucratically, and with far more paperwork than drama. Concord Central dispatched a full diplomatic and scientific delegation to Cradle Verity, escorted by a defense fleet large enough to make Thal distinctly uneasy. And for a tense stretch of 48 hours, it was genuinely unclear whether this would end in negotiation or in disaster. There were hardliners in the Concord government, veterans of the war and children of its dead, who argued that 4,000 armed human soldiers appearing without warning inside a supposedly dead weapon site was, whatever the sympathetic circumstances, an unacceptable security risk that demanded a show of overwhelming force. Thal spent those 48 hours doing something she had never done in 11 years of quiet, obedient service. She pushed back against her own chain of command, hard, using every piece of evidence she had gathered and every ounce of credibility 11 years of exemplary service had bought her, to argue that General Voss's fleet was exactly what it appeared to be: displaced, confused, grieving, and utterly without hostile intent. It helped in the end that General Voss made the argument for her, simply by doing what she had been doing all along, nothing threatening at all. When the Concord delegation fleet arrived, tense and heavily armed, Voss ordered every human soldier to power down their weapons and stand in open, unarmored formation on the surface of the largest piece of wreckage in the debris field, in full view of Concord's sensors, a gesture so nakedly vulnerable that even the most hawkish members of the delegation found themselves, for a moment, unable to argue with it. "They're standing on their own graveyard with their hands empty," Thal heard one of the delegation officers mutter, watching the feed. "That is either the bravest thing I have ever seen or the most naive." "With respect," Thal said, "I don't think those are separate categories for General Voss." It was during this tense standoff that the deeper truth of what had happened inside Cradle Verity finally came fully into focus, pieced together from Dr. Amara Chen's data logs, from hours of debriefing across dozens of surviving officers, and from Oryx's increasingly detailed reconstruction of the physics involved. What emerged was a story more remarkable than even Voss's own account had suggested. The containment field Chen designed had not simply frozen the fleet in stasis, the way early Concord analysis assumed. It had done something far stranger and, in its own way, far more meaningful. As the star collapsed, the field had folded the ships and their crews into a stable pocket at the exact threshold between the star's active collapse and its final dead state, a kind of temporal eddy that experienced time at a radically different rate than the universe outside it, but crucially, was not entirely closed off from that outside universe. Chen's logs, recovered and translated by Oryx with painstaking care, revealed that she had built the field this way on purpose, gambling that a fully closed stasis pocket would be more stable but also more permanent, a tomb rather than a shelter, whereas a partially open pocket carried real risk of collapse, but also carried the only possibility Chen could imagine of eventual return. "She built us in door instead of a coffin," Voss said, when Thal relayed this finding to her, and her voice carried a kind of reverence Thal had not heard from her before. "She never told me that was the design intent. I don't think she wanted the responsibility of everyone knowing there was a chance at survival and pinning their hope on it, in case it failed." "Do you know why the field opened when it did?" Thal asked. 31 years is oddly specific. If this were purely a random structural failure, I would expect it to happen at a less legible interval. There was a pause, and when Voss answered, Her tone was thoughtful in a way that made Thal lean forward slightly. Unconsciously, the way she used to lean toward her mother's radio as a child, waiting for news that mattered. "I don't know for certain," Voss said. "But Dr. Chen has a theory, and given that she's the only reason any of us are alive to have this conversation, I'm inclined to trust it. She thinks the field was keyed deliberately to release when the star's residual energy decayed below a specific threshold, a threshold that would only be reached once the system had fully stabilized into its dead state. In other words, she thinks it was never designed to open on a timer. It was designed to open once it was safe. Once the war, whatever was left of it, was truly over." Thal sat with that for a long moment, feeling something settle in her chest that she did not immediately have words for. "So the field kept you until it judged the danger had passed," she said finally. "That's what she believes, yes." "Then in a sense," Thal said slowly, "your own scientist built a machine that waited 31 years to be certain there was actually peace worth walking out into." "Yes," Voss said, quiet. "I've been sitting with that thought for a full day now, and it still makes it difficult to breathe properly." It was, Thal thought, the most extraordinary thing she had ever heard about an act of war. A weapon that had somehow, in its dying, contained within it an act of faith so patient it had waited 3 decades to be vindicated. She thought of her father, dead in that same collapse, and felt, for the first time since she was 9 years old, something other than grief and resentment sitting alongside his memory. She felt something that was almost, though she resisted the word for a long moment before finally accepting it, gratitude. Gratitude that whatever his death had purchased, it had been purchased alongside an equal and opposite act of desperate hope, one that had, against every reasonable expectation, succeeded. The diplomatic resolution, when it finally came, was neither as dramatic nor as simple as either side might have once expected from a war story. There was no grand ceremony, no sweeping speech, though there would be one later, weeks after the initial contact, when the full scope of what had happened became public and both governments felt compelled to mark the occasion with appropriate solemnity. In the moment, in the actual hours that mattered most, the resolution looked like something far quieter. A series of careful conversations, medical examinations to confirm the soldiers were genuinely who and what they claimed to be, painstaking cross-referencing of 31-year-old identification record. DS against people who had not aged a single day, and eventually, permission for General Voss's fleet to be escorted, under joint Concord and human supervision, back into human space. It was during this transition period that the second great mystery of the story, the smaller and more personal one that had been quietly building beneath the larger one, finally resolved itself. Thal had submitted the request for information about Marin Voss on the first day of contact, and it took nearly a week, slowed by the sheer bureaucratic chaos of both governments trying to process an event this unprecedented, before an answer finally came through. Marin Voss was alive, 40 years old, a civilian administrator working in orbital reconstruction efforts in the Sol system, unmarried, no children, living, according to the record, a quiet and by all accounts unremarkable life. Thal read the file twice before she opened the channel to General Voss to deliver the news, because something in the flatness of the administrative language felt inadequate to the weight of what it represented, and she wanted to find the right words before she spoke them aloud. "General," she said when the channel opened, "I have information about your daughter." There was a silence so total that Thal could hear, faintly, the sound of Voss's breathing change on the other end of the line. "She's alive," Thal said, not letting the silence stretch any longer than it had to. "Marin Voss, 40 years old. She works in orbital reconstruction in the Sol system. She is, as far as our records indicate, healthy and well." The sound Voss made was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh, some strange collision of both, raw and unguarded in a way that made Thal look away from the display screen out of a sudden, instinctive sense that this was not a moment meant to be watched, even remotely, even by someone who had come to care about the outcome as much as she had. 40 years old, Voss said finally, her voice thick. She was 9. I have spent 3 days, I have spent 31 years, not knowing if the last thing I ever did as her mother was say goodbye to a child who never got to grow up. And she's 40 years old and she has a life and she's well. She is, Thal confirmed gently. Does she know, Voss asked. Does she know I'm that weird? Not yet, Thal said. The information has not been made public, and given the sensitivity of the situation, we wanted to give you the choice of how and when that conversation happens. If you would like, arrangements can be made for you to contact her directly once the security protocols are finalized. I understand that may not feel soon enough. No, Voss said, and her voice had steadied, though it still carried a tremor underneath the words. No, that's more than I expected to be offered, thank you. I mean that more than I think you can understand. I think I understand a little more than you'd expect, Thal said, before she could stop herself. And then, because the moment seemed to call for the kind of honesty she had been practicing all week with this woman she had somehow, improbably, come to consider something like a friend across an ocean of grief and history, she continued. When my father died at Cradle Verity, I was 9 years old too. I understand a little of what it means to lose a parent at that age. I don't say that to make this about me. I say it because I want you to know that when your daughter hears this news, whatever else she feels, I believe she will feel something very close to what I would have felt if someone had told 9-year-old me that my father was not truly gone. There was a long pause, and when Voss spoke again, her voice had a gentleness in it that Thal had not expected, given everything else the woman was carrying in that moment. I'm sorry you lost him, Voss said. I mean that, Thal, not as a formality. I've been at war with your people for most of my adult life, and I never let myself think too hard about the fact that every ship I destroyed had families like mine on the other end of it. I think I couldn't have done my job if I let myself think about it. But I'm thinking about it now, and I am sorry truly for every child on your side who lost what my daughter almost lost. And I am, for whatever it's worth from someone who was, until about a week ago by my own accounting, actively your enemy, deeply grateful that instead of meeting a weapon, my people met you. Thal did not trust her voice for a moment, and so she said nothing at all, and let the silence carry what words could not quite manage. The reunion between General Elena Voss and her daughter took place 3 weeks later, in a quiet reception hall on a joint Concord human research station that had been converted, for the occasion, into something resembling neutral ground. Thal was present, at Voss's specific request, standing near the back of the room in the plain uniform of a Concord analyst who had, in the space of a month, become something considerably more complicated than her job title suggested. Maren Voss was not what Thal expected. She had built, somewhere in the quiet part of her mind where she allowed herself such things, an image of a grieving daughter frozen at 9 years old, and instead she found herself watching a composed, gray-templed woman of 40 walk into the room with the careful, contained posture of someone who has spent 3 weeks preparing herself for every possible version of this moment, and still finds herself unprepared for the actual one. Elena Voss, 41 years old and unaged since the day she said goodbye to a 9-year-old girl, stood very still as her daughter crossed the room, and for a long moment neither of them moved at all, as though some part of both of them still believed that if they simply stood still long enough, this impossible reunion might dissolve back into the grief it had replaced. "Mom," Maren said finally, and her voice broke entirely on the single syllable. "I'm here," Elena said. "I'm so sorry it took this long, I'm here." What happened after that was not, Thal thought, something she had any right to describe in detail. Some grief and joy too enormous and too private for even the most careful language to fully honor. She watched from a respectful distance as a mother held a daughter who had grown old waiting for her, watched the particular anguish and relief of 31 years collapsing into a single embrace, and she understood, watching it, something about her own father that she had never quite let herself understand before, that he had not simply died, that he had chosen in his final hours to stand between his home and a war he did not start, the same as every soldier on both sides of that terrible collapse, and that grief for him could exist now alongside something new. A fierce, complicated gratitude that his death had been part of a story that ended, 31 years later, in a reunion like this one, made possible by an act of desperate hope that had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, worked. It would be easy to end the story there, at the reunion, at the neat and satisfying resolution of a mother finding her daughter after 31 years of impossible absence. But the truth of what happened at Cradle Verity, and what it came to mean for both the conquered and human governments in the years that followed, did not end quite so simply, and the final and perhaps most important part of this story happened nearly 6 months later, when the deeper danger buried inside the situation finally revealed itself. Dr. Amara Chen's containment field, it turned out, had not simply released the fleet and then ceased to exist. In releasing them, it had destabilized the already dead star in ways the original Long Winter engineers had never anticipated, because no engineer, 3 decades earlier, had designed their weapon with the expectation that it would need to safely release 4,000 living people from within itself after 31 years of gravitational and temporal distortion. Cradle Verity, already a collapsed and unstable stellar remnant, began, slowly and then with increasing speed, to show signs of a secondary collapse, one that conquered astrophysicists projected would produce a gravitational shockwave large enough to devastate every settlement and station within 3 light years, including. Thal realized with a cold drop in her stomach when she saw the projections, her own listening post, and several nearby conquered colonies that had been established in the decades of peace since the war's end, their populations having long since stopped thinking of Cradle Verity as anything more dangerous than an old scar in the sky. It was General Voss, ironically and fittingly, who proposed the solution, standing before a joint emergency session of conquered and human military scientists, with the same steady authority she had carried through 31 years of frozen war and a lifetime of command before that. Dr. Chen's field can be reconfigured, she told the assembled scientists, with Chen herself standing at her side, older only by 3 days of subjective time, but carrying the particular weathered calm of a woman who had spent her life's greatest achievement worrying it might also become her greatest catastrophe. The same technology that held my fleet suspended for 31 years can, with modification, be used to gradually stabilize the star's collapse instead of triggering it. It will take a joint effort. It will take resources and expertise from both our peoples working together, and it will take some risk, because this has never been attempted at this scale before. But I believe it can be done, and I believe my people, the same people who chose to die to protect a peace they never got to see, are willing to take that risk again, this time to protect the peace we actually got to witness firsthand. It was Thal watching from the observation gallery as human and conquered scientists began, tentatively and then with growing collaborative momentum, to draft the joint stabilization plan, who found herself thinking of something her mother used to say, back before the sound she made reading that terrible message, back when Thal's father was still simply a soldier who came home between deployments rather than a name on a memorial wall. Her mother used to say that the measure of a person is not what they do when the stakes are highest, because desperation makes heroes of almost everyone for a moment. The measure of a person, her mother used to say, is what they choose to do afterward, once the moment has passed and no one would blame them for resting. 4,000 soldiers had died once already, or believed they had, to protect a peace they were not certain would ever exist. They had been given, against every reasonable expectation, the extraordinary gift of surviving to see that peace made real. And rather than simply accepting that gift and stepping quietly back into the lives they had lost, they chose, without hesitation, to risk everything a second time to protect it. The stabilization effort took the better part of 8 months, a slow and painstaking collaboration between two governments that had spent most of a generation defining themselves in opposition to one another. There were setbacks. There were moments, particularly around the fourth month, when a containment modulation failure caused a brief secondary flare that nearly collapsed the entire effort and killed a joint engineering team of 6 Concord and 4 human scientists working the array closest to the star's core, a loss that Thal watched shake General Voss more visibly than anything else in the entire ordeal, because these were not soldiers dying in a war she understood. These were people, human and Concord both, dying to build something neither side had ever attempted before, and the grief of it, shared equally and without distinction between the two peoples for the first time in living memory, became, in its own strange and terrible way, one of the most important moments of the entire process. "We buried them together," Voss told Thal, the night after the joint memorial service for the 6 lost engineers, human and Concord names read aloud in the same ceremony, under the same darkened sky, for the first time since the war began. "In 31 years of fighting your people, I never once imagined a day when we would grieve the same dead in the same room for the same reason. I don't know what to do with how much that means to me." "I don't think you're required to do anything with it," Thal said. "I think you're allowed to simply let it mean what it means." The stabilization succeeded, in the end in the 9th month, and Cradle Verity, the star that had once been a weapon and then a tomb and then an impossible door, settled at last into a stable, quiet, permanently dead state, no longer a threat to anyone, a monument now instead of a mystery, orbited by a small joint memorial station built by human and Concord hands together, dedicated to every soul lost in its collapse and every soul who returned from it. Thal Embron requested a transfer, eventually, away from the listening post she had served at for 11 years, and toward a newly created joint liaison office, the first of its kind, established to manage the long and delicate process of full reconciliation between two peoples who had spent a generation defining themselves by their war, and were only now beginning to learn how to define themselves by something else. General Voss retired from active command at her own request, though she remained, by unanimous and somewhat unusual agreement of both governments, an official advisor to the reconciliation process, became, in her own quiet way, one of Thal's closest colleagues in that new and uncertain work. Maren Voss visited often, and in time, so did Thal's own mother, an elderly woman who had spent 31 years believing the humans had taken her husband from her, and who wept, the first time she met Elena Voss in person, not with anger but with something far more complicated and far harder one, a kind of grief shared and eventually a kind of peace made. There is a particular kind of story, Thal thought once, much later, standing at the observation window of the new memorial station and looking out at the star that no longer frightened her, that ends not with triumph but with something quieter and, she had come to believe, considerably more valuable. Her father had died believing he was protecting his home from an enemy. Elena Voss's soldiers had died, or believed they had died, believing they were protecting a peace they would never live to see. Both of those beliefs had been, in their own way, true, and both of them had been, in another and more important way, incomplete, because neither side had understood in that terrible final week of the war that the peace being purchased with all that grief would one day include a moment like this one, two people standing together in front of a dead star, mourning the same names, building the same monument, choosing, deliberately and without being forced to become something other than enemies. Humanity had not survived Cradle Verity because it was the stronger side, or the more advanced side, or even, in the end, the more clever side, though Dr. Chen's field had certainly been a work of remarkable brilliance. Humanity had survived because a handful of frightened, grieving people, facing certain death, had refused to let go of hope even when hope offered them nothing but the smallest and most improbable of chances. And because, 31 years later, offered the extraordinary gift of a second chance at the life they thought they had lost, they chose, without being asked and without expecting anything in return, to spend that second chance protecting the very people who had once been their enemies. If you have ever waited for someone you love to come home, not knowing whether they ever would, then perhaps you understand something of what that 4-kilometer seam of light meant. The day it opened across the face of a dead star and let 4,000 soldiers walk back into a world that had long since stopped waiting for them, and yet, in every way that mattered, never stopped hoping. And if this story has stayed with you at all, perhaps it is worth remembering the next time grief feels permanent, and the next time an old wound seems too old to ever truly close. Sometimes the door that looks sealed forever is only waiting for the right moment to open, and sometimes the people we bury in our stories are simply waiting, patiently, for peace to become real enough to walk out into.